בוקר טוב. קודם כל אני מבקש להזכיר שהכנס אותו אנחנו עורכים הוא כנס מקצועי, חלה עליו חובת הסודיות הרפואית, זה מה שאנחנו, ככה אנחנו מתחילים כל כנס. רוצים להקפיד שהחומר הקליני, שהוא חלק מהכנס, יוחזר במלואו בתום המושבים הרלוונטיים. מבקש גם להזכיר שחומר קליני מהכנס, כל שימוש בחומר קליני מהכנס יעשה אך ורק לאחר אישור מציג החומר, זו הדרך שלנו להבטיח את האנונימיות המתבקשת. Good morning everyone and welcome to the annual conference of the Primitive Mental State track in the Psychotherapy program of Tel Aviv University, hosting Dr. Franco de Masi from Italy, entitled Psychic Withdrawals from Dissociation to Psychosis. I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Franco de Masi, and thank him for accepting our invitation to participate in this conference. Alina will have the pleasure of presenting Dr. de Masi properly shortly. I will just say, on behalf of us all, I believe, that we feel fortunate and honored that we have this opportunity of spending the day with you, Dr. de Masi, while you share your deep, wide, and thorough knowledge regarding the essence of psychosis and the ways in which we, as psychoanalysts and psychotherapists, can try and encounter, together with our patients, those realms of psychosis, dissociation, psychic withdrawals, and retreats. In his revision of the theory of dreams, written as a part of the new introductory lectures in 1933, Freud makes what I found to be one of his more humanistic references to psychotic states, when he writes, "In psychosis, the turning away from reality is brought about in two kinds of ways, either by the unconscious repressed becoming excessively strong, so it is overwhelmed the unconscious, attached to reality, or because reality has become so intolerably distressing that the threatened ego throws itself into the arms of the unconscious instinctual forces in a desperate revolt. Indeed, many times we feel our psychotic patient trapped in an inescapable, sometimes almost inhuman reality, which it is nearly impossible to penetrate, and with which it is so difficult to communicate. Since Freud's time, many analysts, including Melanie Klein, Silvano Arietti, Wilfried Bion, Donald Meltzer, Herbert Rosenfeld, Peter Giovacchini, Jacques Lacan, Harold Sears, Ping Niapao, Bryce Boyer, James Gortin, and many, many more, including Dr. de Masi, dedicated their professional and sometimes also personal life to confronting the enigma of psychosis, in de Masi's term, or the riddle of schizophrenic communication, in Sears' terms. Before we start our journey to these fascinating and challenging realms, I would like to offer some thanks. First and foremost, to our beloved Alina. The name Alina Shelekes and the term primitive mental state have become almost synonyms in our mythology here in Israel. For many years now, Alina has led the efforts in our program in Israel and worldwide to relentlessly and ceaselessly explore and broaden our knowledge regarding the most archaic, primary, and embryonic strata of the human psyche. We all owe you a very big thank you, Alina, for that and for much more. It's also important to mention, as many of you probably know, that the application process for the upcoming year of primitive mental state studies is now open. ההרשמה למסלול מצבים מנטאליים ראשוניים כעת בעיצומה, וזה הזמן להירשם, להפנות. We all owe you, and you are all very welcome to apply. I would also like to thank all the presenter, discussing, and chairperson of today's conference, חיותה גורביץ, Dr. אילן אמיר, אורנה וסרמן, יואל מילר, and דורית ידיד. Many thanks to Hagit Son, who is responsible in the program steering committee for all our conferences, and to our wonderful and beloved administrative staff, Shirley Milstein, Galit Ben Yehuda, and Shani Han, who, with tons of goodwill and eternal smile, enable us to do all that we do and to be who we are. All intriguing and fascinating conference.
Okay, before I introduce Dr. Franco de Masi, I would like to say a few words about the context in which this conference takes place. The Primitive Mental States Advanced Track was established in 2007 after 2 years of thinking together in the steering committee, which included Naama Keinan, Moshe Landau, and myself. From its primitive beginnings, the track has received a tremendous support from former chairs of the program of psychotherapy, Dr. Michel Granek and Dr. Shlomo Mendelovich, and already for many years from Dr. Boaz Shalgi, whose wisdom, understanding, backing, and patience to all my pleas and nagging is without limit. Since its beginning, our track has grown and developed both in the range of topics we study and in the number of students. So far, 120 students have studied in the program, and of teachers and supervisors who invest a tremendous amount of energy, passion, and knowledge that have made the primitive mental states track such a rich and challenging program and professional home. I would say that one of the special characteristics of our track is that our main focus is not on one theoretical school of thought, but rather on the primitive mental states themselves, seen and studied from various theoretical prisms, each deepening our theoretical and clinical understanding of very early phases of development and very pathological states. This year, after 12 years of activity, we are celebrating the bat mitzvah of our track. And I would like to use, supposing it's a female, yes? And I would like to use this opportunity to express my gratitude to all our teachers and supervisors for their long-standing dedication, and our students, without whose curiosity and desire for learning, the track would not have developed the way it has. Paraphrasing Winnicott's well-known saying that there is no such baby without a mother, I would say that there are no good teachers without engaging and open-minded students, and I can certainly say that our students' curiosity and desire for learning has challenged and developed many of us, both personally and professionally, as teachers and supervisors. As Boaz said, we have opened the registration for our 7th class of students, and I encourage you to read the description of our program of studies that appears in the brochure you have received. And please feel free to address any questions you might have to our secretary, Shani Khan, or to myself. And this is the right moment to express my personal gratitude and that of our staff and students to Shani Khan, who for so many years take care of all the organizational aspects of the advanced tracks in her modest but always so efficient, helpful, and generous way. I would also like to thank Shirley Milstein and Galit Ben Yehuda for all their help in our day-to-day life, and specifically in the organization of this conference. Also, I would like to thank Hagit Tzon for her meaningful help and support in organizing this conference. Last but not least, many thanks to the chairs, discussants, and presenter of this conference, who will be later introduced, and as always, especially to Yoel Miller, my dear friend, whose help, friendship, and tremendous support is hard to describe. Now I would like to turn to the main part of our conference and to our distinguished guest. I'm very pleased and honored that Dr. de Masi has agreed so heartfully to be our guest. I might dare to say that there are not many writers working today whose topics of interest are so close to our track's main focuses as are Dr. de Masi's, whose major interests are focused on the theoretical and technical psychoanalytical issues related to severely ill patients and primitive states of mind, especially dissociation, perversion, and psychosis. And now let me introduce more formally Dr. de Masi. I already did it yesterday when we had a very interesting evening with our students and staff. So Dr. Franco de Masi is a training and supervising analyst of the Italian Psychoanalytical Society. He is former president of the Milanese Center of Psychoanalysis and secretary of the Training Milanese Institute. He is a medical doctor and a psychiatrist who worked for many years in psychiatric hospitals, although yesterday he officially declared that he was a psychiatrist. So you can understand one of the emphases that he's trying to make. He lives and works as a full-time psychoanalyst in Milan. He has published several papers in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, in the Rivista Italiana di Psicoanalisi, and in other international reviews. He wrote several books, among which are Sadomasochistic Perversion, The Object and Theories, Making Death Thinkable, a psychoanalytic contribution to the problem of the transience of life. This book received the Grandiva Prize in 2003. Vulnerability to Psychosis, a psychoanalytic study of the nature and therapy of the psychotic state. The Enigma of Suicide Terrorism, Working with Difficult Patients from Neurosis to Psychosis, Carl Abraham at the Roots of Psychoanalytical Theory, and Psychosis, Discovering the Enigma, which is about to be published soon. He also edited Herbert Rosenfeld at Work, Italian Seminars. So I welcome you, Dr. de Masi.
Thank you for your words. I will speak about a topic that is not usual in our psychoanalytic thinking, that of psychosis and its treatment. I think that perhaps sometime you can have in therapy without knowing a psychotic patient. And you have to understand that the treatment of a psychotic patient is very different from that of a neurotic patient. No? And my opinion is that if psychoanalysis wants to develop itself, I think that the psychoanalytic field of psychosis is very important in order to develop thoughts about the functioning of the mind. So I have to read. The first part of my speech is a theoretical one. The second part is a clinical, and I think that in clinical paper you can see what I said in the from the theoretical point of view. The title is Psychic Withdrawal from Dissociation to Delusion. The topic of my lecture, Psychosis from a Psychoanalytic Viewpoint, was jointly decided with Elina Shelekes, who suggested the title Psychic Withdrawal from Dissociation to Delusion. I shall focus on the concept of psychic withdrawal, a psychopathological structure that sets up the delusion process. This is my idea. Personally, I am of the opinion that a lack of in-depth study on this structure prevents us not only from having a precise idea of the origins of psychosis, but also from being able to explain the development of the pathological process. Introduction. The dynamic model created by Freud that has proved so useful in understanding and treating neurosis, where psychic truth is repressed but remains in the unconscious and can be retrieved through analytic work, cannot be easily applied to the psychosis. Rather than relying upon and making use of repression, the psychotic patient distorts and annihilates the very instruments of perception and knowledge. This means that the analyst's orientation and technique for treating neurosis cannot be used in the customary way with psychotic patients. As I hope to demonstrate, the pathological process in psychosis concerns a mental state whose nature and dangerousness the patient is largely unaware of. Once established, this process produces psychic modifications that cannot be easily reversed and which paralyze or destroy the recognition of psychic truth. Disavowal of reality and psychic withdrawal. In Neurosis and Psychosis, Freud put forward a simple formula concerning the genetic difference between psychosis and neurosis. Neurosis is the result of the conflict between the ego and the id, whereas psychosis is the analogous outcome of a similar disturbance in the relations between the ego and the external world. In a different paper, The Loss of Reality in Neurosis and Psychosis, Freud stated that in neurosis a piece of reality is avoided by a sort of light, whereas in psychosis it is remodeled. Or again, expressed in yet another way, neurosis does not disavow the reality, it only ignores it. Psychosis disavows it and tries to replace it. Disavowal is a much more efficient and stronger concept with which to describe the denial or repudiation of reality that occurs in psychosis. I have cited both of these statements by Freud to say that we may all agree that the psychotic patient denies the external and the internal world, but understanding how and from where this denial stems is not too easy. I realized the importance of the psychic withdrawal over several decades of supervisory work and group discussions with colleagues that treat severely ill children, who are often initially reported by school teachers. So what are these children like? Usually they have learning problems or difficulty relating with classmates and are not actually in touch with others, just apparently so. In reality, they live a secret life parallel to the real one, where they are close in an infantile withdrawal, rich in sensorial qualities, an alternative world to real life, which is often populated by imaginary characters that at times are nourished by obsessively watching television cartoons. Their passivity contrasts with their fantasy world, where they carry out heroic deeds, sometimes violent and omnipotent in nature. The delusional retreat in childhood is not easily distinguishable from the child's normal fantasy, and it is often not recognized by the parents. The most serious consequence of this life in fantasy is that the child does not structure a psychic apparatus capable of understanding psychic reality. What conditions might lead the child towards withdrawal? My hypothesis is that when child who is prone to becoming psychotic may have had parents who neglected him from a psychological viewpoint and were unable to accommodate his emotional communications, or perhaps invaded his mind with disturbing emotional projections. The withdrawal creates a dissociation from reality that serves as a defense against contact with the parents, but also against the relational world. In his book Psychic Retreats, John Steiner conceives the psychic retreat as a collection of defense mechanisms and object relational systems that culminate in establishing the true psychic place to which the subject can withdraw in the presence of emotions that are unbearable for him. Operating to protect the patient from paranoid, schizoid, and depressive anxiety, the retreat can take on a variety of aspects that range from full immersion in a romantic fairy tale world in which everything is idealized, up to masturbatory withdrawal under the dictates of pornographic excitation. The chief consequences of activating pathological organizations, according to Steiner, are withdrawal from objective relation and inhibition of the process of psychic development. Unlike Steiner, I see the retreat or the withdrawal, as I prefer to name it, not a static entity, but one that expands and takes over the rest of the self. This explains the pathogenic power of some retreats which, after being established in childhood, can lead to a psychotic episode in adulthood. In this connection is the case of a 14-year-old girl indicated by her school as having difficulty studying and integrating socially. Isolated from her schoolmates, she had an attention deficit, making it difficult for her to study. During her consultation with the therapist, she spoke about her malaise and the other world she lived in. In this fantasy world, where she spent most of her day, she had 2 children and was married to a very successful man. At home too, when having dinner with her parents, she would get up and go to her room to enter this world that would summon her and continually seduce her. She had to tend to her children. This dissociated life, existing in parallel to her real one, eliminated her need to relate with peers, and when alone, made her believe she had a stimulating adult existence. In a case like this, it can be foreseen that the withdrawal will turn into a clear delusion when the imaginary world gains the upper hand and presents itself to the patient as being real. Life in fantasy. In an earlier work, I distinguished intuitive imagination from flight into fantasy and emphasized the importance of differentiating positive imaginings, which are needed to keep future horizon open, from construction of parallel worlds dissociated from reality. When a child plays, he can distinguish between play, make-believe, and reality. The child who lives in a psychic withdrawal loses this ability to distinguish between the two because fantasy assumes the nature of being real. Whereas play enriches the emotional world, sensory withdrawal stunts the child's epistemophilic drive and captures him in a closed and autarchical reality. Melanie Klein came very close to conceptualizing the withdrawal when she wrote, "Then there is the child who lives in fantasy, and we can see how, in their play, such children must shut out reality completely and can only maintain their fantasies by excluding it altogether." These children find any frustration very intolerable because it reminds them of reality, and they are quite unable to concentrate on any occupation connected with reality. Subsequently, Cline did not develop her consideration on this mental state, it being furthered much later by Steiner, but she did develop the importance of primary destructiveness and projective identification in the psychotic state. It was Winnicott that wrote a case on this condition. O'Shaughnessy described the psychotic withdrawal process well when she differentiated between the child who could overcome frustration using the precursor of thought, crying until the mother rushes to comfort him, for example, and the child who is less fortunate that evacuates frustration and reality instead of modifying it. This second type of child does not cry, but remains silent and focuses his attention on some sensorial detail. This is the beginning of withdrawal, which avails itself of sensorial channels, creating a pleasant reality that removes the child from the dependence that can foster his relational and emotional development. The sensorial world remains split off from the real world over a long period of time, and the individual can live in one world one moment and then in the other. The psychopathological construction of the withdrawal can be kept on and even kill indefinitely, but it usually tends to expand and dominate the rest of the personality. Several kinds of withdrawal, in particular those that lead to psychotic developments, become the means with which to create sexualized, grandiose, and persecutory omnipotent worlds. Instead of developing thought and nourishing psychic reality, the mind in the withdrawal is used as a sensory organ, which produce sensory images and acoustic perception that, in the advanced stage of psychotic process, will cause hallucinations. Typically, the situation becomes evident when the sensory constructions that have been built up in the withdrawal but kept dissociated for a long time begin to invade the healthy part of the personality. It is at this point that the psychotic patient is brought to the attention of psychiatry, but the long preparation that got its start in childhood should not go unnoticed. Disjunction of twofold reality. By dissociation, the psychotic withdrawal, I don't mean a vertical split of the personality in which one part does not know the other, but rather that the world of psychic withdrawal is fed only by sensorial fantasizing that is separated from the world of relation. Two parts, the healthy one that is in touch with the relational reality, and the alternative world built in by sensorial fantasizing, coexist but do not communicate with one another. Non-communicative cohabitation between the two mutually exclusive opposing realities is created. A very clear example of this situation is experienced by one of my patients I described in Delusion and Biocular Vision, about whom I shall speak in more detail in my second lecture. Francesco is a patient who began analysis because of an extremely widespread persecutory psychosis. In the course of his therapy, he had many delusions, one of which centering on his partner with whom he lived and who had borne him a son. He was convinced, as very, very terrified, that she, the wife, the female, wanted to kill him, but despite being terrified, he preserved the perception of his partner as a nice person and a good mother. I worked for a long time on Francesco's delusion, and at a certain point he realized that he had a biocular vision of reality. I noted the great precision of his statement. He did not say that he had binocular vision, as would necessarily be the case if the two visions should meet and be compared, because it lacked integration. The two visions, one delusion and the other real, remain distinct and differentiated from each other because they both possessed the same perceptual character, that of reality. In the case of Francesco, in delusion withdrawal, the world of the senses and of fantasy presented itself as another reality that never met up with psychic reality on the relational experience. Hence, the two visions, sensory withdrawal and psychic reality, respectively, could not become integrated and produce insight as they exist alongside each other. The origin of the dissociated nature of delusional experience is connected, in my view, to the fact that delusion is the heir to infantile withdrawal, which presents itself as an alternative dissociated reality to that of psychic experience. Here, the word dissociation does not signify a vertical split within the self, in which one part of the personality is unaware of the existence of the other. To use Francesco's metaphor, his vision is divided in two. It is biocular. With one eye, Francesco can live in the world of withdrawal, while with the other he can see reality again. Since the two visions do not meet, he failed to achieve a binocular vision that could help him to understand the falsified nature of the delusion. After all, the principle of non-contradiction ceases to apply in delusion. In classical logic, any proposition to the effect that a given proposition A and its negation, the proposition non-A, are both true at the same time in the same way is false. As a corollary of the failure of the principle of non-contradiction is that if a statement and its negation are both true, then any statement is true. This is a principle of delusion. Logicians call this consequence the principle of explosion. The mind is explosive. For this reason, the distinction between truth, reality, improbability, probability, possibility, and impossibility is lost in the delusion system, thus triggering an omnipotent explosive mechanism that knows no bounds, and it is unstoppable. Indeed, with the loss of the notion of time, place, separateness, and identity, the absurd become possible and real, with a potentially infinite progression. Returning to the initial question on denying reality in psychosis, we may say that reality is denied via the construction of a new sensorial reality that is an alternative to real life. Rosenfeld highlighted that the patient perceives himself as living in a world of an object that totally separates him from the outside world. The delusional withdrawal creates the conviction of being able to find absolute pleasure in a condition of total anarchy, which is why the delusional nucleus ends up attracting the healthy part of the personality, persuading them to distance themselves from the relational world. That this patient's social life seems lackluster and that they are indifferent to their surroundings and unable to fulfill life tasks, therefore adds up. Every commitment in the real world becomes a source of fatigue and anxiety. A benign withdrawal. Not all forms of withdrawal lead to psychosis or delusion. As I mentioned, some may remain silent throughout life without turning into psychosis. It's not infrequent to discover that patients in therapy have a fantasy world that stably exists alongside the ordinary world. In these cases, the withdrawal into fantasy, considered by the patient as important for his psychic equilibrium, can remain without invading the rest of personality. One of my patients who presented a rich phobic symptomatology always idealized life in fantasy at the expense of real life. When she met a man she liked, she would not seek a relationship with him, but use him to nourish her fantasy life. She would keep away from him and use him in her inner world as a character who would be with her always and love her passionately. But then, once the fantasy would begin to fade, she would feel the need to see him again in the flesh to replenish the fantasy relationship. In cases destined to become psychotic, however, the breakdown manifests where the sensory construction created in the withdrawal dominates the healthy part of the personality. If this patient could be a psychotic, he can develop an erotic delusion, not a fantasy, no? Distinguished by the reality. In case destined to become psychotic, however, the breakdown manifests when the sensory constructions created in the withdrawal dominate the healthy part of the personality. Silent energetic activity precedes a psychotic break. Just as a wooden structure suddenly collapses, eaten away underneath by a colony of termites busy at work, so too the psychotic breakdown sudden after much long, constant labor. Psychotic part of personality. This is how Freud put it. Two psychical attitudes have been formed instead of a single one. One, the normal one, which takes account of reality, and another which, under the influence of the instincts, detaches the ego from reality. The two exist alongside of each other. The issue depends on their relative strength. If the second is or becomes stronger, the necessary precondition for a psychosis is present. If the relation is reversed, then there is an apparent cure of delusional disorder. Freud is very acute. He writes, apparent cure of the delusional disorder. Rosenfeld commented that despite having formulated the concept of the ego splitting into a normal and a psychotic part, Freud did not further this intuition in his clinical work. A new perspective on psychosis and delusion opened up after Melanie Klein's writings on the mechanism of projective identification, In her opinion, the specific pathogenic mechanism of psychosis is projective identification, that is, the projection of aggressive and destructive part of the self into an external object. Linked to the paranoid schizoid position, this mechanism consists in the infant fantasy to project split-off part of the self into the mother's body in order to control her from within. These fantasies then become the source of the anxiety related to being imprisoned and persecuted inside the object's body. Melanie Klein thought that when projective identification is massive and prolonged, the projected parts are then difficult to retrieve. Bion proposed a dynamic reading of psychotic as well as neurotic functioning. The neurotic part operates according to assimilation, introjection, and discrimination, whereas the psychotic part violently projects in order to eliminate psychic elements that it cannot digest. Intolerance to frustration, which beyond connected to excessive envy, creates hatred toward all couple links, mother-child, analyst-patient, part of the self. Attacking the link destroys symbolic language, which is what generates meaning. I do not share the idea common to several Klein authors that the psychotic part is present, albeit it's not slightly, in normal and neurotic individuals. In my opinion, it is one thing to speak of psychotic functioning in some neurotic patients, but another to speak of clinically psychotic patients. Which clinical work in mind? By the psychotic part, I mean a psychopathological structure that distorts psychic reality and produces hallucination and delusions. If the patient begins analytic treatment after hospitalization, then the psychotic part has already colonized the healthy part of his personality. When the patient has not had a psychotic episode proper, has never been hospitalized or under the care of psychiatrists, it's more difficult to bring the progressive action of the psychotic part to light. As mentioned earlier, very frequent is the case of patient who conceal his withdrawal in a psychotic world behind apparently good psychic functioning. I therefore use the term psychotic part differently from Bion, who employed it to refer to that part of the personality where destructive instinct and hatred toward inner and outer reality predominate, and which is nourished by an excessive congenital predisposition to aggression and envy. In my opinion, the psychotic part does not derive from destructiveness, but it identifies with that part of the personality that can create a world dissociated from human relational reality. Using the mechanism of psychic withdrawal is, I believe, more helpful in order to describe and understand psychosis and its dynamic. Returning to the neurotic psychotic parts, contrast is not merely a case of their functioning differently, but being antagonistic, with one part, the psychotic one, trying to assimilate and colonize the other. Opposing ways of experiencing psychic reality alternate between omnipotence of thought and use of the mind to accept reality and connected frustrations. In individuals destined to develop psychosis, there is an unstable balance between the two. The healthy part of the personality becomes conquered in the end by the psychotic part. A female patient who suffered psychotic episode brought this dream to analyze following several months of apparent remission. The dream is this. I'm driving my car in a narrow street, quite naturally, which surprised me a little. At a certain point, I decided not to follow the road signs anymore, and I realized that I'm driving against the traffic coming towards me. This scares me, but it excites me, and at the same time, too. I think that I really need to take some driving lessons, but then I decided that I don't, and I can't just keep going like this. In the end, I feel very distressed, lose control of the car, and end up in a desertified land, a Martian landscape full of cactus-like plants. I feel very, very alone. This dream might be considered as a portent of the patient captured by the psychotic part, represented here as an exalted and transgressive state that pushes her to go against road traffic regulation in a mix of fear and excitement. In her mind, there is but a vague awareness of being led by a dangerous and transgressive part. In fact, she asks herself whether she needs driving lessons, and then decides that she does not. The psychotic part takes over and leads her to a desert land where each and every relation with a human being is erased. The psychotic part function is well represented in this dream and is of great help to the analyst to prevent a new psychotic episode from occurring. As can be seen from the clinical material, it is almost as if in her dream the patient sees her healthy part as a pointless habit that can be wiped out by excitement coming from the psychotic part. In these cases, it is important to describe to the patient the omnipotent, excited, and seductive fantasies connected to the psychotic split-off part in order to prevent, with all possible limits, the patient's healthy part with which the analyst has established his therapeutic relationship from being overwhelmed. Not to be lost sight of is the fact that the psychotic part offers the patient no respite, whereas the neurotic patient is not easily attracted to madness because he fears it. In this case, anxiety is dispelled by the appeal with which the psychosis entices the individual and leads him astray, often by offering omnipotence. Frequently, the therapist is misled by the fact that the patient keeps his inclination to delusion to himself and ends up believing the patient's explicit communication without making any contact with his psychotic aspect at work below the surface. Anxiety emerges too late on, when the patient has already been conquered by the psychosis, and at which point he realizes that he can no longer leave the situation he himself has created. The psychotic part of the personality, as mentioned earlier, is heir to the infantile withdrawal, a place characterized by sensory fantasies that a certain kind of child builds in order to feel that he is a ruler of the world. Much time goes by before the delusion is clinically evident. Freud advanced in this point when he wrote, "It may be that the delusions which we regard as a new formation when the disease breaks out have already long been in existence." Conclusions. The pathological process in psychosis concern a mental state whose nature and dangerousness the patient is largely unaware of. Once established, this process produces psychic modifications that cannot be easily reversed and which paralyze or destroy the recognition of psychic truth. The complexity of the problem of analytic technique regards the fact that psychosis does not concern the dynamic unconscious but more basic mental functionings which leads to the patient distorting his thought function outside awareness. The psychotic patient destroys the tools that would allow his unconscious to understand psychic experience. He is in fact unable to unconsciously repress and process experiential content. He cannot dream, like Beyond said, and is therefore unable to benefit from work done by the unconscious. This is why interpretative work, the main tool in analytic technique, cannot be easily applied. Consequently, the analyst cannot use with the psychotic patient the same approach that he does with the neurotic patient. He must forget what he has learned from his personal analysis, from clinical practice with other patients, and from discussions with colleagues. A normal neurotic patient understands the meaning of an interpretation because he uses the intuitive unconscious function that allow him to read and translate as psychic truth what the analyst proposes. After a usual interpretation, he, the neurotic patient, can therefore integrate the context, whereas the psychotic patient will continue to deny psychic reality. The radically concrete nature of the delusional experience poses very knotty therapeutic problems. Unlike the dream, which can be understood and transformed, the delusion cannot, due to its predominantly sensory nature, it is extremely risky to formulate interpretation of its content for the delusional patient, as they can lead to misunderstanding and mix-ups. When the analyst tries to interpret a delusional fantasy symbolically, the interpretation is perceived by the psychotic patient as a concrete reality, or as a revelation that another world exists, and not a psychic reality of which he is unaware. The psychotic patient core problem is his creation of a sensorial world that takes the place of thinking. Immersed in this world, his mind is no longer able to think, as it is engaged in images and inner dialogues, that is, in a parallel world he considers as true and real, one that is separated from relational reality. This is why the patient finds himself with no radar with which to understand and learn from his experience. Emotional communicative functions are not hardwired, but gradually develop in a favorable environment, that is to say, when the child's mind is in contact with another human being's mind, a mother or a caregiver that fosters its development. Unconscious functioning is strictly linked to emotion, to quality, and to object that stimulates them. This process is missing in the person who is destined to become psychotic, as he has withdrawn into an alternative sensorial world that neglects the world of relationships and emotional growth. In order to develop the patient awareness during the therapy, the analyst must repeatedly describe the dynamics with which the pathogenic part entices him to the withdrawal, detaching him from his relationships, the analytic relations included, and offering him false benefits of a life alternative to that of reality. Clinical experience has led me to think that intrapsychic interpretation, those that describe the dynamics and the mutual relationship between the opposing part of the personality, in particular the psychotic and the healthy parts, are extremely useful for strengthening the patient insight, as I showed before with the dream. In other words, it's helpful to treat the psychotic withdrawal, which corresponds to the psychotic part of the personality, as a dragging structure that tends to drain away the person's vitality and sacrifices emotional growth for the power of sensory pleasure. A bond can thus be established between the patient's healthy part, which is always in danger of being weakened by the psychotic withdrawal's enticement, and the analyst, whose objective is that of helping the patient to eventually draw a distinction between parts which what is pleasant but destructive for the mind as psychotic one, and what is good and constructive. The psychotic patient does not speak openly about his psychotic part functioning. Rather, he conceals it, in particular the functioning of the illusion structure, which he sees as precious and does not wish that it be questioned by the therapist. Here we find ourselves facing a typical problem of the psychotic state, that of confusion between the healthy and the sick part. The delusion can offer the patient the delights of a pleasant reality that is sensorially rewarding. It therefore seems not only useful but indispensable, so much so that it needs to be hidden from the therapist. I would like to underline that the ease with which the patient allows himself to be seduced is due to the fact that the psychosis presents itself with exciting and salvific features, and this exciting part that avoids suffering at the cost of perverting reality is considered by the psychotic patient as good and positive. Consequently, the ill part is seen not as dangerous but a source of well-being. Besides this patient who do not disclose their withdrawal, there are those who do, either at the very beginning of therapy or at a later stage. The patient who does not reveal his delusional ideation to the therapist runs a greater risk of becoming completely dominated by the psychosis. The therapist must therefore intuit its existence and tactfully point out the dangers. Otherwise, a psychotic episode may suddenly appear as if from nowhere, now here, when in actual fact it was secretly in the pipeline. The delusion experience avails itself of the psychotic mind's ability to make imaginative thought sensory. In these mental states, the psyche is not employed as a means to understand reality, but to produce sensation and perceptions. That is, it is used as a sensory organ. What fundamentally characterizes the delusion, as mentioned earlier, it is ability to construct an imaginary sensory world. At a certain point, however, this new pathological functioning of the psyche escapes the patient control and is no longer able to distinguish between newly created reality and pre-existing reality. The patient is conscious of the delusional representation, but is not aware of its falsified nature. In the delusional state, the patient does not think, he sees or feels as if he were daydreaming. While dreaming, we consider the dream content as real, but when we wake up, we understand that it is an affective, emotive narration, that it is not real at all. The dream, after all, is a symbolic experience that connects back to the dreamer's emotional meaning, his wish, conflict, or anxiety. The delusional experience has no awakening, doubts, or distancing, since it is not a symbolic narration, but a concrete perception. In my opinion, the child destined to become psychotic is not so much stimulated by aggressiveness, but rather by a particular tendency to isolate himself from the relational world so that he may build with his imagination another dissociated world. Placed in the service of his fantasy, this dissociated world is appealing because there is the limit of existence and the frustration of reality never have to be faced up to. The destructive effect is not primary. I am not following Kleinian thought about the nature of psychosis, because Bion, other colleague, underlines that it is hate against and the breast, the reality, and so on. The destructive effect is not primary, this is my opinion, but the consequence of flight into unreality from which it is difficult to return. In order to construct a dissociated world, the patient must alter his sense organs and abolish his thinking capacity. Given that this process is usually accompanied by a pleasant state, the subject is unaware of the danger this operation can lead to, the withdrawal turning into a prison with little possibility to escape. The pathogenic structure, once set in motion, ending up looming over and dominating him. I am finishing now. When working with the delusion, the analyst is in a difficult position because he cannot expect to take the patient back to a previous stage of mental health with interpretative work, assuming such a stage ever existed. His work requires much time and patience to discover the tools the patient uses outside awareness to distort mental functioning. Considerable imaginative effort is needed to enter into worlds so far away from our own. Even great competence acquired throughout the analyst's clinical experience might not be sufficient when having to deal with the field of psychosis. I shall seek to illustrate in my second lecture, through the description of the long analysis of one of my psychotic patients, how the road to recovery can be difficult but not impossible.
Thank you very much for such a rich, deep and interesting lecture, and I'm sure we'll have enough time also for questions that come to our mind. We have a heavy schedule, so we don't have much time to breathe. Before I introduce חיותה, I would like to mention with something which I didn't at the beginning, that Dr. Emilia Perroni, who is sitting on the right side of Dr. de Masi, is not Boaz Shalgi, but is Dr. Emilia Perroni, and she is of Italian origin, and she was so kind to agree to help with translation if needed during the discussion. So thank you again, Emilia. For those of you who have not discovered, there is Hebrew translation of everything in the brochures, both English and Hebrew translation. And now we are going to the discussion of the first lecture, and I'm very glad to introduce those who do not know her, חיותה Gurevich, who is a training psychoanalyst, a clinical psychologist, and a training analyst of the Israeli Psychoanalytic Society, where she teaches and supervises. She is a teacher in the Primitive Mental States track and at Winnicott Center. So thank you very much, חיותה.
Thank you very much, Alina, for inviting me to discuss Dr. de Masi's paper. And thank you, Dr. de Masi, for your compelling and riveting lecture. Okay. You bring up critical issues concerning the complexity of pathological psychic dissociation and withdrawal, which tend to evolve into psychotic delusions. During the same years from which you quote Freud about psychosis, Sandor Ferenczi dedicated his work and life, I may say, to the treatment of pathologically dissociated and psychotic patients whom Freud considered as unanalyzable. Similar to your claim, that treatment of these patients differs from that of neurotic patients. He suggested that such states are not accessible to symbolic interpretations. They originate at the stage of tenderness before the ego functions develop and are the intrapsychic imprint of external traumatizing failures. They are not represented and are not governed by the pleasure principle, but rather by the principle of repetition compulsion, and need to be acted out and enacted with the analyst in order to be experienced. Only then, in the intersubjective field, through the mutual union of the patient's and analyst's psyches, can they be represented. Winnicott further elaborated upon the external environment's impact as crucial for the development of the self. Pathological withdrawal is a survival self-holding in states of traumatic absence of contact with the other to such a degree that annihilation anxiety floods the psyche into an unbearable extent. He states that in his example with X plus Y plus Z. The external dissociation from the child's distress is simultaneous to the intrapsychic rupture. Furthermore, intrapsychic dissociation promotes withdrawal, and withdrawal enhances dissociation. The investigation of pathological dissociation and withdrawal must consider the intersubjective origin of this phenomenon and the external impact on it, just as you and other recent theorists increasingly do. Ferenczi's radical ideas have been dissociated from psychoanalytic theory and even thought of as delusional, but are now revived. Dissociation is an inborn capacity of the mind which operates normally to differentiate between self-states, endowing them with a sense of real me via mirroring, validation, or reverie of another. When those environmental functions are traumatically absent, me states are totally dissociated, so that tapping them arouses a compulsory repetition of fear of breakdown, which enhances dissociation and pathological withdrawal. A relevant issue is the developmental and expansive quality of the dissociated parts. Ferenczi describes in his clinical diary how these parts continue to develop and delude oneself that the external environment cannot violate the self, quote, feeling of being bigger and cleverer than the brutal force. They also evoke protest against violence and injustice, contemptuous, perhaps sarcastic and ironic obedience. Sorry. In addition, wish-fulfilling hallucinations, consolation fantasies are produced, which anesthetize the consciousness and against sensations as they become unbearable. End of quote. Dissociated states are prone to develop delusions and hallucinations which disavow psychic pain and vulnerability. This allows the false self to go on functioning in obedience and adjustment to the environment. This sense of omnipotence is inherently oblivious of the reality of the psyche's fragmentation, which has already occurred. The delusional ideation can be dissociated or conscious, but, as you say, cannot be realized in actual intersubjective relations. Furthermore, it continuously influences other psychic states, hindering the revival of dissociated me states by arousing the threatening fear of breakdown. Your assumption that children who tend to withdraw to fantasies are prone to develop delusions as a consequence of excessive early environmental failure is a crucial one. Those wise babies, as Ferenczi called them, can use their minds for survival self-holding. Yet, differing from theories of pathological organization, I suggest that all delusions contain a grain of truth in them. They have a notion of the initial traumatic absence and can fantasize salvation by reversing the conditions that cause the psychic catastrophe. If it were a result of not enough holding, the only salvation can be that of incessant clinging. If an absence of holding resulted in feeling emptiness, then one has to constantly fill it up by an unceasing breast, etc. The very possibility to delude oneself, as you say, stems from the mind becoming a sensory organ. It provides a rudimentary sense of the traumatic state and suggests the reverse solution, rendering with a sense of real when immersed in sensations that operate as real perceptions. This is linked with the primitive and primary functioning of the mind and with the omnipotent ideation of the stage when early trauma occurred, before the psyche differentiated itself from external reality. The sensory layers produced by the mind are the vicissitudes of the initial annihilation anxiety, and their reversal is promoted by this primitive mode of functioning. To further develop it requires assistance. For instance, Francesco's persecutory delusions may have been reminiscent of being scared by others, helplessly having to dissociate from these feelings due to the environment's dissociation from his distress. However, this fear of being violated by others warns him whenever there is any hint of such a state in the present. It is the analyst's function of recognizing this that may reduce the need to delude persecution into realistic fear or sense of danger. But not only is the content reversed, so is the quality of the delusions. Bion's concept of alpha function in reverse may shed some more light on these phenomena. In the absence of maternal alpha function, psychic elements may be transformed by rudimentary alpha functioning into elements that seem like alpha elements, as if having representations, but are not and do not. They resemble a transformation of beta elements, but they lack the ability of real beta elements to be transformed into constructive and represented alpha elements. For instance, the excessive absence of a good breast is used by the tender psyche's initial use of alpha function to regard the anxiety arising from it as incessant hunger, for which an incessant breast would be the only relief. In reality, however, had there been a mother's reverie and holding, anxiety would have been relieved not by an incessant breast, but by adaptive feeding and soothing the anxiety. Such delusions and hallucinations contain a grain of the initial absence and the wish to repair it by avoiding annihilation anxiety, and they are experienced as totally concrete and real. They are founded on a dissociated acknowledgement of the traumatically initial absence. Following these assumptions, another point I would like to elaborate on is that of the clinical implications that you suggest. I agree with you that the analyst should point out the delusional quality of the patient's ideation and describe the internal complications that delusional thinking bears upon the rest of the psyche. But merely pointing out the pathological organization is not enough. Just as pathological dissociation and withdrawal originate in a traumatic environment, so is their reactivation in the actual present relations with the analyst. What is also needed is a historical explanation of the survival need for developing the delusion and how it is reflected and repeated in the present relations with the analyst. Dissociation and withdrawal are inevitably acted out and enacted in analysis. The dissociated states seek their revival via these survival modes, in need for an other who will provide what had been absent but never given up, while simultaneously threatened by fear of breakdown. Basic trust in the analyst is crucial and depends on the sense that he actually provides adaptation to the patient. This does not mean incessant satisfaction, but rather adaptation to the patient's needs according to the analyst's ability. The analyst's failures should be understood through the way they influence the patient. If the analyst takes into account the complex and multiple qualities of what is enacted, he would recognize his multiple and complex roles as the external other who in the concrete present arouses the repetition of early trauma. His needed role is that of a caretaker who, unlike the traumatizing one, takes responsibility for the failure and provides the patient with a safe condition for self-assertion. The patient may now experience his vulnerability instead of dissociating it and withdrawing to pathological self-holding. Embedded in a good enough environment in the present, the inevitable failures are crucial for making a difference between the traumatic occurrence in the past and its experience without dissociation in the present. Survival modes should not be regarded as resistance, but as paths for reconstruction of dissociated schemas. They are manifestations of early dissociated imprints, of external absences, which the injured psyche needed to rescue itself from. Recent theoreticians highlight the analyst's actual role and involvement in fulfilling the crucial absent environmental functions that promote symbolization and representations. I quote from Ferenczi. Patients cannot believe that an event took place or cannot fully believe it if the analyst does not take seriously the role one assumes of the benevolent or helpful observer. That is actually to transport oneself into that period of the past, a practice Freud reproached me for as being not permissible, with the result that we ourselves and the patient believe in its reality, that is, a present reality which has not momentarily transposed into the past. End of quote. In Winnicott's terms, the past is alive in the present, and to experience it together renders a sense of real to what has occurred but not experienced, enabling it to be experienced in the present and represented. The external absence is thus present in the intersubjective field. This is the potential cure for a ruptured self. Experiencing psychic pain may be frightening and terrible, but it is alive, not dissociated and dead. Survival in vulnerability is transformed into human suffering. I will try to demonstrate my different reading of the dissociated delusional withdrawal by rereading in reverse the dream of your patient in the car. If we read it backwards, the initial state is that of being very alone. I do wonder if anything in the present relationship with you triggered this, or what happened to trigger this dream. Being with no contact with an other leaves her to drive herself alone through life. All others drive their way and she's alone, feeling that they are all against her, and this scares her. The initial helplessness and annihilation anxiety are aroused. She resorts to her survival mode, which excites her at the same time. There is no one to guide her. She has a glimpse of this, so she immediately resorts to telling herself that she doesn't need it and can withdraw to omnipotent self-holding. Expressing her need for protection and guidance would arouse a fear breakdown. But she's aware in the dream that this solution does not work in reality, not even in the dream. She loses control and is very distressed. Being alone, needing help, leaves her in a non-human environment which only repeats and arouses her anxiety. Obviously, this dream indicates that she can experience her vulnerability and let the analyst know about it. Mutual recognition of her survival delusions as mean of surviving external traumatizing absence gradually frees the patient from being locked up in this pathological organization and allows her to re-enter human contact rather than remain deserted in a desert land, losing control when not held properly by another human. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to חיותה for such an excellent discussion that I think raises quite a few questions. Would you like, Dr. de Masi, to address any points in חיותה's discussion?
Many points. Io credo che noi ci muoviamo da due punti di vista diversi.
Come un interprete.
Ma non puoi tradurre, non conosci bene. Vabbè. Allora, I think that we with the problem with the two different vision, point of view. Because my colleague is from a point of traumatic viewpoint, no? And me have another idea of the problem psychosis, because there are many psychotic patients who had terrible and traumatic experiences, no? But some patients, like Francesco, I will show him his history, is not a traumatized patient. No? I think that the problem of Francesco was that he lacked mind organization, because he had good parents but absent parents. They are not able to structure his mind. No. From this point of view, I have another conceptualization of my colleague, because I think that psychotic withdrawal is not the same used by Steiner and used in his point of view. That is a defense against anxiety. But is another kind of retreat, is a delusional. The mind of psychotic child is full of omnipotence. He has a pleasure to alter the vision of psychic reality. So, in which I am in different opinion. Ferenczi was the first who tried to cure psychotic patients, but in this time the psychoanalysis has not such acknowledgement of the other kind of defense and transformation of the mind. So Ferenczi thought that it was possible to transform the psychosis through the psychic emotional relations with the psychoanalyst. It's not possible, because psychosis is another world. If we think about the problem of transference in psychosis. The transference in psychosis is not possible, a normal transference, because the psychosis has not a symbolic thinking. For forming a transference, the patient have to have a symbolic thinking. So, the psychosis is possible that they develop a psychotic transference. It is very dangerous. In the case of Francesco, I describe a moment in which he developed a psychotic trance with me. So, the psychosis, this normal neurotic transfer is possible with psychosis patient only in an advanced stage of the therapeutic. No. So the difference between and you is I don't think that the first thing is the trauma. The trauma is a very important origin of some or more and more illness, psychic illness, but not necessarily in the psychotic state. There are many psychotics that are full of trauma, but other no. What the problem is the desire of the patient to change the mind. We can change our mind using as an organ of pleasure, an organ of perception. It's not normal also for us, but we don't use normally this possibility of your mind. So I think that the trauma is not a necessary event. The necessary event is a retreat from the reality.
Thank you for your remarks. I think that there is a difference between us of how we define trauma. Because if you say that the parents are absent and cannot figure out his psychic world, then if we go to Winnicott, and also Ferenczi, then this is the trauma. The traumatic impact is the fact that the child has to begin to use his psyche in a different mode in order to hold itself, to survive. So the very fact of absence is already traumatic. If we regard trauma as an internal psychic situation or condition.
I agree with you, because I think that trauma is very important for developing all kind of suffering. Without trauma is not a suffering psyche. But we have to distinguish what is the consequence of trauma. In some cases, there is an inhibition of developing, such as the patient we saw yesterday evening. There is traumatic absence of parents, and the patient, Zeniel, stopped his evolution. No? In these cases, like psychosis, there is a disturbance that I name pathological organization. The first is a trauma, but after there is psychopathological organization. In these cases, this psychopathological organization is psychotic withdrawal, is different. And all the illness is created by pathological organization. For example, when you interpret the dream of the patient is driving a car, you have in mind her primitive anxiety to be alone. When I interpret a dream, I ask myself, what kind of patient I have, because the same dream are different from different patients. I have in mind a psychotic patient who had a psychotic episode. Is driving with excitement to go out of against the other people. I think the psychosis is a destructive operation of our mind. The most important pathological organization against the thinking possibility. In this dream, the patient is exalted of go against the other cars. So interpret this kind of dream because I have a psychotic patient, not a traumatic, abandoned child. No, it's different. No, the difference is I have to persuade, using this term, to the patient not to be colonized by psychotic part. For example, Ferenczi could not have in mind the differentiations made by Bion between psychotic part and the part. He did, but he worked with this concept. No, he worked with the relationship with the patient, not with a classification between a differentiation between the healthy part and psychotic part. No, he did without. Fenn said a reparation idea. We cannot repair the psychotic split. We have to help the patient to growing the healthy part. This is a technique. It's a different technique.
Maybe to complicate things, I might ask some additional questions. I think that your emphasis is on the organization, the structure of the psychotic patient, whereas חיותה puts more emphasis on the content behind this structure. What? Content and context of the content of the psychotic structure, how it came to being, and what we can hear from this content. And indeed, these are two very different, each one of them very interesting perspectives. What I would like to ask in addition is how you differentiate between a psychotic withdrawal in which the mind becomes a sensory organ and an autistic withdrawal.
It seems that they are, for some aspects, the same, but the autistic withdrawal is very primitive. No, very, very primitive. It's a sensorial, without imagination, without a representation. In a psychotic withdrawal is a representation, a narration, tragic narration or exaltation of, but it is more mature, I think.
But if there is a representation, then the content would be meaningful. So the question is to what extent you would work with the content that is present in the delusion. Because if we take, for instance, this dream, I wonder whether you would work with it differently if it were not a dream, but a reality.
But
it is a dream, so there is some symbolic operation going on, and it is told as a dream in the therapy.
But it's a very important question, because the psychotic is not aware of beginning of delusion. A psychotic patient, as Francesco, said to me for many years, I'm not able to understand in which way I became delusional, because the transformation is unconscious, very deeply unconscious. When the patient began to dream, he can dream the psychosis transformation. We made a paper with Paola Capozzi about the dream of psychosis. And we discovered that some patients, we not to discover, other, also a psychiatric, French psychiatrist wrote this that also Freud what about Schreber, before beginning psychotic, the patient can dream his psychosis. In these cases, the female patient dream her psychosis, who can begin to invade them. This is a description. You have not to interpret symbolically, because it's a description of a transformation. If you comment and describe this to the patient, possibly the patient can begin to think about this transformation, that begin to be aware of this. In our paper, we wrote a paper with Paola because we formed a group about psychosis 20 years ago. And Paola brought a patient of her who had a psychotic breakdown, was hospitalized, and after he went to psychoanalysis with Paola. We commented this patient for months, and we saw that the patient was not psychotic, was neurotic with anxiety and so on. Abruptly, he made a breakdown of psychosis. And Paola and I in the group asked ourselves why we don't know anything about this possible transformation. And after this, Paola and I began to read the material before this breakdown, and we saw that there were a lot of dreams in which the patient was describing the psychotic transformation. And from this moment on, Paola began to work with the patient, illustrating and commenting their dream. And after this episode, the patient had no other episode and was very improved. But using the dream is an unconscious communication in which her mind began to understand what kind of transformation was. So it's very difficult this is a very easy case. But for my patient, we will see this. I have this part 15, 70 years, and for 70 years, he always had a delusion, a very tremendous and dangerous delusions. And only after many years in which I accompanied him to go out this delusion, now he has a good improvement because his personality is improved. Not only the symptom of delusion, but he is a very childish, a psychotic person. And so he was a more mature man.
Please let me add that Dr. Paola Capozzi is not only Dr. De Masi's wife, but a psychiatrist and training psychoanalyst of the Milanese Psychoanalytic Society, and she's here in the first row. I think we should open the discussion for questions from the audience.
Thinking about current lack of agreement. I wonder if we could think about moments in the session when a delusion is apparent or withdrawal is apparent. I think both of you would agree that these moments happen when the analyst is absent, when suddenly either there is a narcissistic insult from the analyst towards the patient, or there is a sudden absence of the analyst's presence in the patient, to the patient, that he doesn't feel the analyst. And then suddenly the analyst finds that the patient is withdrawing into one of his delusions, or into a sensory fantasy of his delusion. I wonder if we could approach this question of the environment, early environment failure, as trauma or as lack of mind structuring. Because for me, the early environment is responsible for the early mind structuring. And that's when the parents do not bring up the patient, do not create the psychic mechanisms of health.
My mind is when the patient is openly delusional in the session, you have to hear to him, not interpret, not intervene. And you have, in my mind is the question, how is able to construct this kind of the word, persecutory word, or when I have some idea of this, I can begin, when it's possible, to offer to him some hypothesis in which he can begin to think about his disposition to have delusional world. With the trauma, it's very important because there are two kinds of patient. One kind of patient is that they began their analysis with claiming about their trauma. I was a victim of my parent, I am a victim of my parent. So other people doesn't speak about their trauma. Also, we can imagine that they had trauma. Psychotic patients are of this second kind of patient. They have no any idea of their trauma. Why? Because they cancelled his childhood, their childhood. I had a psychotic patient when I was very young. I was a bit omnipotent and very young as a psychoanalyst. Who was psychotic, borderline psychotic, and I asked him when he was for the first interview, what kind of mother was your mother? She's a beautiful, beautiful woman, a very kind mother. I remember a good childhood. So, towards the third years of analysis, it came out that the mother was psychotic 1, was hospitalized, shocked 3 or 2 times when he was very child. His mother spoke to him of her delusion, in which she said to the child that she will die and he, the child, will go to the cemetery to rasp. It is a terrible mother, and he remembered that he refused to go in the room in which the mother was. So he's very traumatized. But the first account was a beautiful, kind. So they are deny the reality also of trauma. After many years of psychoanalysis, you can accompany the patient in order to have a relation with his trauma.
I think just to emphasize the question is to what extent you would see an event in the transference, in the session, as relivening the beginning of dissociation or withdrawal into delusion. To what extent, if the patient experiences you in a certain way, may increase his delusion in the session?
No, you have to. I said that sometimes the patient can form in psychotic transference, no? No. Relieving the sensations of trauma.
If the patient experiences you as, let's say, not attentive or disappointing or absent in any way, would this increase his delusional thinking in the session?
Yeah, I have an example of this kind of experience. When I was a bit megalomaniac and young with this patient, with this terrible mother, I was a very Kleinian. So I interpreted always the bad part of its aggressiveness, megalomania, and so on. And he had a transference psychosis, not a psychotic transference psychosis, which he lived me as his mother, because his mother was very destroying his mind, and he developed a psychotic transference, a transference psychosis, no? Because psychotic transference is when the analyst is included in a delusional, in a previous delusional. As Francesco did, he included me in his persecutory ideation. This patient developed a transference psychosis. So I was persecuting him, but the rest of life was free of persecution. No? I was included in psychosis transference because many times, I did not understand of him. I interpreted only the aggressive, hated part of his personality. For example, one session, he asked me that an old lady went to his pharmacy, because he's a pharmaceutic, he's a pharmacy people, doctor, pharmacy. And he said to me that the other people began to despise this old lady. His only was who understood the old lady. And I interpreted, like a stupid Kleinian, that he was exalting himself at the expense of others. I have to think that for the first time he had pity toward his mother. So there was a psychotic transfer, and he was very, very wise for me. He began to come to the session, but he did not enter in the office. He left a letter on the people, portinaia, come si dice? Shoer. In the letter he wrote, "Dear Dr. de Masi, I left you 3 days free in order that you can think about me." In this time, I read a paper on international by Rosenfeld, in which he described a transference psychosis in a similar manner. I thought about this, and I began to discuss with the patient why I did not understand him, and why the interpretation that he judged wrong. And for some time we discussed, and I changed my opinion. I don't ask excuse, but I agree with him that my interpretation were not right, and he began to transform his transfer psychosis. So it's possible. But the patient, in this case, the patient Francesco, if I tried to interpret in a symbolic way, there is a terrible danger of augment the delusion. And this is problem. Ferenczi was a very important analyst. He wrote an important book on psychosis. Wrote that he had the destiny to have in therapy many psychotic patients that the other colleague of America sent to him, because this kind of patient were worse and worse. Because if you work with interpretation symbolic, you can have a mess in the.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the break, I would like to say that the next session will be chaired by Dr. Ilan Amir, who is a psychiatrist and a training psychoanalyst of the Israeli Psychoanalytic Society and a teacher in the primitive mental states track, and does a lot of other things that many of you know. So we are back at 11, and thank you very much again, Dr. de Masi and חיותה.